the Russians are still going to commit the type of atrocities they have committed since the beginning of the hostilities, with the indiscriminate bombing, the rocketing, the UAV assaults on innocent populations in Ukraine. That'll all still continue, but it just, the ground offensive is going to slow down. It won't stop, but it's just going to dramatically slow down. The weather is that powerful when it comes to offensive operations, where it makes it easier for those in the defense, so the Russians, and it makes it harder on those who are trying to conduct offensive operations. In this case, the Ukrainians.
To Colonel Brendan Kearney, who's a military affairs analyst, former chief of staff for the US Marine Corps forces in Europe, and worked closely with NATO. Good evening to you, Colonel Kearney.
Hello, Carol. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Really good to speak to you. Clearly, President Zelensky is somewhat concerned that the appalling upsurge in fighting, the attacks on Israel, the counterattacks on Gaza, are going to distract many of Ukraine's allies. Do you think there was a sense of that when he was visiting NATO today?
Oh, I do think so. I think he's wise to get in front of NATO in the sense of with a visit like today's, just to remind him, hey, and acknowledge he knows a very, very serious situation is going on in the Middle East, but to remind them that, look, we've got a very serious situation ongoing in Ukraine, and we need your support. We know you have to support Israel, but at the same time, please don't forget us. We need help.
Yeah, because we have seen, of course, that attempt at a counter-offensive, which saw Ukraine regain some territory, but there haven't been the really significant gains that clearly the Ukrainians would have liked, but also that some allies who've been pouring weapons and other equipment into Ukraine would have liked.
You're exactly right. I think the goal that everyone was hoping and praying for was to see the Ukrainians get to the Sea of Azov and go ahead and cut off that land bridge between southern Russia, southwestern Russia, and the Crimea. It has not occurred. May it yet still occur? Possibly, but with winter fast approaching there in that part of Europe, the odds become a little bit against what the Ukrainians would be capable of accomplishing.
And as we've discussed before, of course, the Russians are really well dug in, aren't they, along those front lines along the east of Ukraine. Very, very difficult indeed for the Ukrainians to break through. But those efforts so dependent on Western support.
Well, they are. The thing is, though, and I want to differentiate this, the Ukrainian requirements were such that we had to provide weapon systems along with ammunition, communications gear, all those types of things, training to use some of the different weapon systems that were coming from the diverse NATO countries and other countries that are friendly to Ukraine. That's not going to be quite the situation with what Israel is going to require. They've got a very, very sophisticated military, one of the most sophisticated in the world. Their requirements in terms of ammunitions, like 155 millimeter artillery shells, that specifically will compete with Ukrainian requirements. So that's going to have to be very carefully husbanded out to both those areas, to the Middle East and then into Ukraine. But the Israelis are not going to require, at least not right now, aircraft, air defense systems, big items like that would require training and other sort of things that have been an intense requirement for our support to Ukraine.
Yeah, interesting that. And Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, who's on his way to Israel, before he left, was saying that the US would ensure that Israel has everything it needs. But of course, this comes at a time when we've had that crisis in the U.S. House of Representatives. A deal was reached to get a federal budget through that essentially left out more funding for Ukraine.
It did leave out more funding for Ukraine, but the spigots of the logistics pipelines, all these supplies that have gone to Ukraine were turned on months ago. And they can be turned on or continued on very, very quickly. A lot of the things that were promised to the Ukrainians here 6 months ago are only now being delivered. That's the type of lead time that it takes to do some of the things they're doing for Ukraine. And I think you and I talked about this months ago, but in many respects, that's good, because if the Ukrainians got everything they wanted all in one great big shipment, they couldn't handle it. It would overwhelm their logistics capability, their training capability, their ability to employ these weapon systems and the ammunitions that are coming in. So it's better off having a consistent supply coming in, whether it's too slow or slightly too slow for the Ukrainians. They're going to have to put up with that. But in the long run, I think this is not going to, the U.S. legislative dilemma is really not going to hurt the Ukrainians over the long term.
And of course, there is now a hope and an expectation of some movement on that with the process of getting a new speaker in place. And it's worth remembering as well, isn't it, that there's no question of NATO actually taking sides in this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, this long-running conflict. NATO is not going to get directly involved there. The US may be providing Israel with some weaponry, but there are it's a very different question to NATO's support for Ukraine.
You're completely right, and you sum it up very, very well. There simply is no consensus among the NATO countries to support Israel specifically over the Palestinian cause. The Palestinians have done really a superb job over the last 40, 50 years in going ahead and building support in Western Europe. And there's a lot of countries that if you go into them and you're wearing an Israeli flag lapel pin, you're not going to be well received. The Palestinians have done a good job with that. Now, can they sour some of that support if these atrocities that are being reported now turn out to be true? Yes, but I still don't think it's going to be to such an extent that you'll see the type of support that Ukraine enjoys from NATO. It's just not going to be on the same level.
Well, I should say that there is extraordinary extent of evidence of the atrocities that have been carried out by Hamas in Israel. But despite the lack of any intent of NATO to get directly involved in this, there is clearly a concern, isn't there? And we had a Ukrainian MP on the programme last night voicing this, that the whole attention of Western leaders is going to be focused much more on what is happening there. Of course, the risk that the violence could escalate, could spread more widely to the region, and that is really going to deflect attention away from this long, grinding war in Ukraine.
Oh, it is. I think naturally it is. And again, it's coming at a time where combat is naturally going to also slow down because of winter coming in. So you're just not going to see the level of combat. It's still going to go on, and I'm sure the Russians are still going to commit the type of atrocities they have committed since the beginning of the hostilities, with the indiscriminate bombing, the rocketing, the UAV assaults on innocent populations in Ukraine. That'll all still continue, but the ground offensive is going to slow down. It won't stop, but it's just going to dramatically slow down. The weather is that powerful when it comes to offensive operations, where it makes it easier for those in the defense, so the Russians, and it makes it harder on those who are trying to conduct offensive operations, in this case, the Ukrainians.
Just one final point. We were talking about the role of the US in supplying, of course, the biggest supplier of military hardware to Ukraine. We're still waiting for that budget issue to be resolved. And there is a further concern, isn't there, in Ukraine that as we near the election next year and the possibility of a new president, perhaps even a return of President Trump, that could really affect matters in the long term?
It could, and our election system. You know it well enough. There's a lot of there's a lot of attention deficit disorder that goes on in both parties when it comes to these type of real challenges. And Trump has been pretty blunt about his sense of support or lack thereof of Ukraine by the United States. The thing is that the legislative branch of the United States, the Congress of the United States, for the most part, and this is across both parties, is supportive of Ukraine, and they can just as quickly through the War Powers Act turn off military intervention, but they could also just as quickly override a presidential veto and go ahead and force continued intervention on the part of the United States in the case of Ukraine.
Colonel Brendan Kearney, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme tonight.